We are very excited to announce a new free ICSA webinar series on SMGA recovery. This series is specifically for second and multi-generational adult former cult members. However, this is going to be the first program for SMGAs that is open to all. In the past, ICSA workshops for this population have been limited to those who were themselves born or raised in cults. But we see the increasing need for mental health professionals, educators, academics, researchers, and others to understand the vast needs of second and multi-generational adult former cult members in their journeys in recovery. My name is Ashlyn Hilliard, and I work for the International Cultic Studies Association. I am now very excited to present to you Bill Goldberg, our first presenter in this series. Bill Goldberg, LCSW, PSYA, is a clinical social worker and psychoanalyst with more than 40 years' experience working with former cult members. He and his wife, Lorna, co-led a support group for former cult members, which has been meeting for more than 40 years. It is the oldest group of its kind in the world. In 2007, Bill retired from the Rockland County, New York Department of Mental Health, where he directed several programs and clinics. He is presently an adjunct professor in the social work and social science departments of Dominican College, and he is on the faculty of the Institute for Psychoanalytic Studies. Bill has published numerous articles in books and professional journals and is a frequent speaker at ICSA conferences. Among other awards, in 2010, Bill was the recent recipient of ICSA's Lifetime Achievement Award. He is also co-editor of ICSA's Cult Recovery, a Clinician's Guide to Working with Former Cult Members and Their Families, published in 2017. Without further ado, I will now turn the time over to you, Bill Goldberg. Thank you so much for being here today.
Welcome to this series of webinars, which are focused on the issues that are often part of the experience of being an SGA or an MGA. I should mention that these letters are a shorthand way of saying second generation adult and multi-generation adult. The term refers to individuals who are born into and or raised in a cult. So I'll use the term SGA, MGA. That's what I mean. I mean people that were born into or raised in a cult. Over the next several weeks, former cult members and experienced therapists will discuss issues such as the impact of cults on childhood development, the harsh conscience of SGAs and MGAs, sexual issues and recovery from sexual abuse and growing up with spiritual abuse. Our hope is that by hearing these presentations, you will be able to put your own experiences into perspective and will recognize that they were not unique to you, but were also felt by others who grew up in a cultic environment. That does not mean, of course, that your experience was less valid or less painful. But our hope is that you may feel less alone and perhaps less misunderstood by significant people in your life and by yourself in your own assessment of your feelings and behavior. Now, many times people who contact me ponder whether the group or relationship that they left was severe enough to be classified as a cult. My response is that whether the group had enough factors to classify it as a cult is almost irrelevant. The definition of just what constitutes a cult is different for a theologian or a therapist or a historian or a politician or just about anybody. This is an amorphous term. The important factor is whether the group or the relationship had a negative impact on you. Even if you conclude that the group you were in does not fit all the criteria that you would use to define a cult, you may be able to relate to some of the examples and benefit from some of the suggestions that you'll hear in these webinars. Today, I'm going to give an overview of some common experiences of individuals who were raised in a cultic environment. First, let me recognize that your experience growing up in a cultic environment led to your assuming as a child that some unhealthy or even brutalizing encounters were acceptable or even good for you. All children, even those who did not grow up in cults, were taught things that don't make sense to them. You have to take a bath when you don't want to. You have to brush your teeth, even though that's a chore. You go to bed when you're not tired, and you get up when you'd rather stay in bed. None of those things make sense to a child. Adults make the rules, and children learn that they can't always do what they want to do. Most children come to accept that they have to conform to the adult rules because we're told in the long run, the adults are looking out for our best interests. In the cult, however, some of those rules that you came to accept turned out to be not for your best interests, but in the best interests of a cult leader who may have behaved like a spiritual vampire who lived off the spirit, enthusiasm, and good intentions of their followers. Cruelty may have been justified as being helpful discipline and learning experiences to make you a better person. Rules that were designed for the comfort of the cult leader and to reinforce his or her hold on the group were rationalized as being necessary and reasonable only for the sake of stifling dissent, which was the real purpose. As an adult, looking back, most people who were not raised in a cult come to understand that the rules that didn't make sense to them when they were a child were, in the long run, in their best interests. As someone who grew up in a cult, you may be attempting to distinguish between those rules that you now accept as understandable and those that, even in retrospect as an adult, were what they originally seemed: arbitrary, cruel, and senseless. George Orwell said that authoritarians don't use words to illuminate the complexity of reality. They use words to eradicate the complexity of reality. Difficult issues are not supposed to exist in the cultic world. They're simple black and white answers to every dilemma. If you follow the cult's path, you're righteous or healthy or smart or spiritual. If you reach a different conclusion, then you're wrong and sinful or misguided or evil-minded or prideful. Simple, black or white. As an example, I worked with a family that had suffered the tragedy of the death of a young child. Their cult leader came to their home while they were grieving and announced at the front door that before he would enter the house, he wanted the parents to proclaim their thankfulness for God's wisdom. Under the guise of being a faithful Christian, the leader was robbing the family of their legitimate and healthy need to express their grief because he didn't want to have to deal with it. Growing up in a cult is like bending over your whole life to avoid hitting a ceiling that someone told you was there. When you realize that there was no ceiling, you're so used to bending over that you continue to bend over, and maybe you grow up in that bent position. All of us, whether we were raised in a cult or not, must come to grips with stories that we were told for one purpose, but when we look at them as adults, may take on a different connotation. For example, the story of Abraham's intention to sacrifice his son Isaac was told to us as a wonderful example of faith and obedience. Now, as adults, we may want to contemplate whether the hero of that story should be a man who would kill his son in order to prove his subservience to God. Is it possible that a real hero to that story would be a man who would say to a God who demanded such an action that he was not willing to obey such a cruel and arbitrary command? Perhaps the hero of that tale should be the man who would respond, I'm willing to do many things as an act of loyalty, but this command is not one that a reasonable deity would make. I won't do it. Joni Murphy, in another context, said that throughout history, there has never been a story of brutality that was not retold by somebody as a story of heroism. Martyrdom is an indication of the intensity of one's beliefs. It is not an indication of the correctness of one's beliefs. The first time that we were told as children that we have to encounter a difficult situation, the feelings that experience engenders becomes imprinted in our minds. And whenever we as adults feel ourselves to be in a similar emotional circumstance, we may automatically respond as if we were a child again. Our emotional reaction is to feel small, powerless, and insubstantial, as we did the first time we encountered that traumatic situation. In the case of those raised in a cult, when they encounter a person in authority who makes an unreasonable demand or tries to bully them into a behavior, they may feel as if they were a child back in the cult who is being reprimanded for being bad. They may not recognize at the time that as adults, we have the right to call somebody out for their bullying or question what right they have to judge us. These are possible adult responses to a situation that were not available to them when they were children in the cult. But when we as adults encounter similar situations, we always feel as if we were a small child again. And it takes us some time or some help or some thought process to recognize that we have other tools that we didn't have as a child. Most people think that as they mature, they give up their childlike mind and replace it with a more substantive, more fully developed mind. The image is that we human beings start out, say, with a Mini Cooper car, and then we trade that in for a Camry, and then we trade the Camry in for a station wagon, etc. Instead, the truth is that we start out with that Mini Cooper, then we add on features to the Mini Cooper that help us to function as adults. But that Mini Cooper is still in there. And in times of stress or crisis, we can fall back on that childlike Mini Cooper mindset. We act as if we were a helpless child again, rather than as an adult who has rights, power, and the ability to call out others for their abusive behavior. Children are sponges. They're constantly absorbing rules, even when those rules are not, and even when they are not ostensibly involved in a lesson. They observe, for example, how people are supposed to show affection for each other. How do they show disappointment? How do they show anger? If they're angry, do they give each other the silent treatment? Do they rant and rage? Do they slam doors? Do they slam each other? How do adults respond when they're with people of authority? Do they act childlike and meek? Do they permit others to dictate to them? Do they openly or secretly rebel? How do they respond when they're told to do something that they don't want to do? Watching your parents act in an obsequious manner to another person, especially a person who you may not respect, can lead to feelings of disdain for your parents. When you leave the cult, Those feelings of disdain towards adults may cause you to automatically scorn all authority figures. Even if that scorn is deserved, that response to authority is probably not going to be appreciated by a boss. Most children try to please the adults who are significant in their lives. That reaction is almost universal. The issue for us to ponder is, what behavior did you, as a child, feel would please an adult? If there is sexual abuse, the child learns that the adult wants them to be sexual, so they display sexually provocative behavior that's inappropriate for a child. Or they may go in another direction and disavow their sexuality when they become young adults. Donnie Whitsitt and Katharina Meredith will be discussing sexuality later on in this series of webinars. All children, including children who are grown up in cults, learn to play roles. Some children in cults are parentified. They take on the task of raising their siblings because their parents are unable to fulfill that responsibility. Cult parents often spend time away from the family as they serve the needs of the cult. A few children, usually those who are related to the cult leader, become the golden child who can do no wrong. These children, who are treated as narcissistic creatures, often will terrorize adults and other children and act as a tyrant. Some cult children become rebels and secretly or blatantly oppose the directives of adults. Sometimes SGAs and MGAs find that they're continuing to act out their childhood role in adulthood. For example, it is a common phenomenon that the adult children of alcoholics who played a rescuer role in their families will choose a partner who is an alcoholic or in some other ways needs rescuing. Other SGAs and MGAs, when they become adults, rebel against the role that they've always played and instead go in the opposite direction. The problem occurs when individuals find themselves stuck in a certain role and that they're almost always playing that role in every relationship. Or they might be unconsciously repeating situations time and time again where they're playing that role. Sometimes individuals will find themselves recreating the dysfunctional relationships that they grew up with in the cult. They may always find themselves becoming rescuers or rebels or enforcers or helpless children or a combination of those roles. Even though that role is problematic for them, they unconsciously are driven to repeat the role because it's familiar to them. The number of roles that an individual can take on is endless. An ideal situation is one in which SGA MGAs have the capacity to play different roles depending on the requirements of the situations that they may encounter. It's a sign of health, for example, for someone to be able to say, playing this role or taking this stance may have worked for me in the past, but it doesn't work for me anymore. Now it's time for me to have a different approach to life. Now, I'm not suggesting that you abandon an ethical or a moral stance, but as we get older and our life circumstances change, our worldviews can also change. The person who has the exact same approach to life that he or she had 10 years earlier has wasted 10 years of growth. They're not in the same place. Similarly, sometimes SGAs and MGAs and others will interpret present-day situations as if they were replays of the dynamics of childhood situations. Again, instead of being able to assess the situation, they may react as if they were back in that traumatic event from their childhood. We all create a history for ourselves that's a distortion of the truth, because our view of our complicated selves can never account for all the nuances of our childhood, and our childhood influences our present-day sense of reality. That's part of the human existence. We create a history for ourselves that in some ways is real and in some ways is a distortion. When he was running for president, Ronald Reagan would tell a story that was told to him by a GI who had been in World War II. The plane that the GI was flying in was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft missile. Everyone was ordered to bail, but one man who had been injured could not do so. The pilot said to his comrade, "You shouldn't die alone. I'm going to go down with you." The rest of the men survived, but these two brave men perished. Reagan's eyes would fill with tears as he told that magnificent tale of American spirit and sacrifice. It's an inspiring story. The problem is that it never happened. It was a scene from the movie A Wing and a Prayer, but Reagan remembered it as if he had been told it by one of the eyewitnesses. One common feeling of SGA MGAs is that they missed the sense of purpose that they had when they were in the cult. Because they were led to believe that everything they did when they were in the cult had cosmic significance, the mundane day-to-day life outside the cult may seem to be insignificant in comparison. Sometimes these feelings are tied to a sense that they'll be punished for not following the true path. Another common circumstance is that SGA MGAs feel cut off from others because they don't have a common frame of reference. One of the young adults at a presentation I attended related to how, when she was rescued from the Alamo Foundation cult, she attended a public school for the first time. She was too embarrassed to ask her classmates, "What's a Beyonce?" It's common for SGAs and MGAs to feel a profound sadness and sense of deprivation about the loss of their childhood because of the demands that the cult and the insensitivity of the cult leaders had towards the child's needs. As I mentioned earlier, this feeling of deprivation can lead to an intense reaction to parental figures. It is common for SGAs and MGAs to feel fury towards their parents for the fact that their parents' choices resulted in their being raised in a dysfunctional cultic environment. Many SGA MGAs are deeply affected by hypocrisy or betrayal from authority figures or others. They're constantly scanning the horizon, looking for these characteristics, and they react with a profound sense of injustice when they're seen. I'm getting towards the end of today's webinar, and we're next going to open up the program for questions and responses. But I wanted to end with some thoughts for you to ponder. First, there's nothing wrong with being angry. The hard part, though, and the part that we all have an obligation to ponder, is being angry at the right person, at the right time, with the degree of intensity that fits the situation. Some SGA MGAs have adopted the stance that they have to please people, and they feel compelled to say yes to almost anyone who asks something of them. Sometimes they even know while they're saying yes that they're going to regret it, but they find it difficult to say no. If that's a characteristic that you have because of the way you grew up or for any other reason, you may want to answer every request with the phrase, "Let me think about it. I'll get back to you tomorrow." That can become your automatic response instead of yes. With this technique, you're buying yourself time to consider whether the task is something you really want to do. And obviously you have the option of saying yes or declining it after you've thought about it. If you're one of the people pleasers that I'm referencing here, remember that you don't owe most people an explanation for why you're saying no. If you give them reasons why you can't or don't want to do something, you're leaving yourself open to their counter arguments to try to talk you into doing a task that you don't want to do. Every objection that you raise, they will have a counter argument. And then you're stuck right back where you started. In most instances, the statement, "I'm sorry, that's not something I'm interested in doing," will suffice. If you're asked why, you can just repeat the statement again with a smile. "I'm sorry, that's just not something I'm interested in doing." Maya Angelou said, "Never make somebody a priority for you when all you are for them is an option." You don't know what's around the corner unless you peek. But it's okay to hold someone's hand while you're taking that peek. And finally, I want to quote one of my favorite all-time quotes from George Orwell, who, as you know, wrote 1984, An Animal Farm. He said, "Saints should always be judged guilty until proven innocent." We're going to go live now, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions anyone has or to listen to your comments and your reactions to this webinar. Thank you.